Okay, so welcome everyone to the shadow side of the feminine. I'm your host, one of them, Blair Lindsay, and today I am so delighted and honored to bring you Dr. Ellen Heed. So Ellen Heed she calls herself the orgasm mistress. She helps women who have difficulty with orgasm to heal. She is a sexological body worker who's been on the faculty of many international trainings in the last 20 years. She has a clinical practice based out of LA. And Ellen, I'm just so excited to speak with you about the shadow of the feminine today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Blair. It's a very interesting work, and I'm so excited that you're doing this, that you're bringing this forth into the cultural conversation. I think we're a little reticent to dive into shadow work or even a discussion of the shadow. So I'm really, when I saw you were doing this and I got your invitation, I'm like, oh yeah, this is something that needs to be brought forward. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, me as well. And we talked beforehand about this talk in particular being a space where we can set a framework for what the shadow is and drawing on your expertise in the body, how that impacts the body and how we heal from it. And before we dive into that, I would love to hear from you. What is the feminine for you?
That's a really interesting subject. It's fraught in this day and age because prior to the emergence of the transgender movement, I could say with impunity, the feminine is this, the feminine is that. Now, because people have a multiplicity of ways to relate to their gender, it's very easy to get labeled as essentialist if I say the feminine is this, but I'm going to describe the feminine in my own way. When I had an epiphany of the absolute feminine nature of nature. I went to, this comes from my psychedelic past.
This also seems to be a theme in the summit.
Okay. Well, you want to get to know your shadow. It's like the shortcut route, right? So for a long period in my history, I lived with a plant magician kind of person. And the plant spoke to him, and he had a mystical relationship of knowing what the plants needed as a grower. We grew entheogenic plants from all over the world. So he was a plant collector, a plant trader, a plant educator, and a plant nurturer. And one day we decided it would be fun to go to the orchid warehouses in Carpinteria. And there are these long, corrugated metal or, kind of corrugated plastic, giant greenhouses that used to be in Carpinteria where it was nothing but orchids. And they were blooming. It was the season. And we said, and they were, they'd let you go in and browse and you could buy if you wanted and stuff. And so we went in and we took a quarter tab of acid before quarters. So we're walking through this greenhouse and there's every orchid of every description. And I'm looking at these orchids with the kind of expansion at my brainstem that's letting all the information in. I'm looking at these orchids and I'm like, oh, they're all genitals. They're all genitals, and they're not male genitals, they're female genitals. Nature is female, at least in the orchid world. And it landed in me so deeply. And I'm like, it's not limited to humans. It's about the shape of something that's so essential to an expression of nature that's trans species and transgender and trans kingdom. The plant kingdom is different than the animal kingdom. And we tend to get so personalized around our concerns as primates in the animal kingdom. But what about the plant kingdom that's showing us all the time the sexual nature of nature? Mm-hmm. And that in nature there are gendered or sexed plants, but they don't have our overlay of culturated expectations, like
Mhm.
a female plant acts like this and a male plant acts like that. What we have is one that's producing pollen and another that can receive that pollen and turn it into a seed that grows into a plant. Orchids are fascinating because of their variability. They're two huge species families in the plant kingdom, and one is orchids, the other is mushrooms, and they reproduce very differently. But the orchids just really sunk in as the feminine is the reproductive engine of nature. So that would be how I would define it, very broadly, in other words.
Yeah.
And hopefully going bigger than and including, but not being limited by an essentialist definition.
Yeah.
Because that's so much in the zeitgeist, the conversation these days. And it's concerning because I think we lose sight of the power of the feminine when we're worried about limiting it to a way or trying to sidestep
Right.
the connection between reproduction and femininity. That is not essentialist, it's just one piece, but it is a very large piece. It's how nature works, is reproductively and creatively. So I think we could say essentialism, but really big picture.
Yes.
Really big picture.
Yes. Thank you so much for bringing this up. I appreciate what you said about the feminine being the reproductive engine and how having those conversations even within the environment where we are sidestepping certain things to be politically correct, or because is this going to trigger something? Is this going to trigger a conversation or instigate something that I'm not prepared for? But what you're saying, I think, is so profound, that there is this essential energy that is the reproductive engine.
Yes. I mean, it's hard for me because my father was a biologist and came from generations before there was the multiplicity of definition of sexuality. However, shades of gray are always present in nature. And shades of gray are present, or variation, infinite variability. That's part of the reproductive engine of nature, is providing pluralism, or even more than pluralism, multiplicity of expression. So I would say that the feminine is outside of political, for me, the feminine steps outside of political boundaries.
And even you said yourself, transgender. It's transgendered. We're not speaking about it as it only applies to women, but as a universal energy, the engine in nature.
That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I really love that definition. And then what does the shadow mean for you?
Well, I think about Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who is such a profound storyteller. And a lot of her work is defining or refining our understanding of the shadow in terms of story and psyche, and how story and psyche are so deeply intertwined to express this piece of us that we like to keep buried, that we like to keep subterranean because it's too frightening.
Yeah.
It's frightening. It makes us uncomfortable. We like to think we've perfected ourselves, so we're outside of our shadow material. But I would suggest that the minute we even have that thought, we're actually in our
Exactly.
The shadow is part of our creative expression. It's part of what drives us toward evolution, toward change, toward getting so uncomfortable where we are that we need to take that next step and take that next step. So I think it's a profound motivator if we can drop our fear and walk right toward it and see it for the creative potential it represents.
Absolutely. Because the shadow is also holding a lot of information and power and potential that we are disconnected from when it's not conscious.
Right. If we can keep, I think the definition of conscious is that of shadow is that it's consciousness that's yet to be pulled into expression.
Yeah.
And I find this so often in my work with people on my table, is that what I'm doing is holding their hand and walking them toward their shadow as it resides in their symptom in the body. And if they're willing to take that journey, they can see huge shifts in their symptomology, whatever it is, whether it's pain during sex, whether it's some kind of complication in their reproductive systems, whether it's unremitting chronic pain. Those are all messages from the shadow at some level, that there's something that needs attention, there's something that needs attention, and it's up to us to include psyche as part of any investigation of physical symptomology. We have to find that intersection of where psyche and soma cross, because that's where it's like, here's this psyche, soma, it's right where they cross. The deep part of the V, that's the shadow right there. And so we're willing to walk into, to dive into, in some cases, that shadow material and take a good look around and know that we're safe while we're looking, because that's why it's sometimes good to have a partner when you're diving into shadow material, someone who knows that terrain, is comfortable with that terrain, and create a container of safety around diving in to shadow. That really can make the journey worthwhile, because what one learns when you walk out the other side, in Chinese medicine they call it going through the Po. The Po is like the deepest, darkest, nastiest part of your large intestine. In Chinese medicine, we take a journey through the Po and come out the other end. It doesn't get a lot more shadowy than that.
It's a very euphemistic way to just say, like, you're going through the deepest layer of shit that there is.
You got it. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I love Chinese medicine because of the poetic nature of their descriptors. You know, it's not just large intestine. Yes, we're diving through the shit, but it's also represents the transformation so we can pull nutrient out of food. And this is what the shadow represents, the transformation, so we can pull the nutrients out of our experience and assimilate them. That's the potential of working with shadow material.
Beautifully said. And very clear. Thank you. So can you speak more about this intersection that you work in, this intersection of psyche and soma, and what would you like to say about that?
I'd like to say that this is coming from a long tradition that goes back to Jung. Jung really had a lot to say about symptoms being a message from psyche, that there's something unresolved that needs to be brought to light, and that the symptom, the cure is in the symptom. He said that. Exactly. That's a direct quote. The cure is in the disease. The cure is in the symptom. So we have to walk toward the symptom, and most people are wanting to like cover up the symptom or make it go away. But the symptom is a message that there's something going on in the psyche. And again, this maps back onto Chinese medicine, which says the root cause of symptomology and disease is emotional. Therefore, there's an emotion that maps on to every organ system in the body. So the shadow, for instance, we could talk about large intestine, since I already brought it up. Large intestine is married to lung as a dual system in Chinese medicine, and the energy of lung is grief. And let's say there's unresolved grief about a death, perhaps, that, you know, we think we're over it and we keep going forward, but our symptoms persist, and what we need to do is go into the grief that hasn't been processed and walk through it to come out the other side, to see what that grief has to say about our own fear of our mortality. And this moment, this tiny little moment that we're alive in the, you know, planetary continuum, this little flash of light that is our life, that is so brief. And how do we pull our fears up by the roots around our existential fear to walk through and resolve the grief that is like grief, and underneath that is fear. fear of dying, fear of our impermanence, fear of letting go of control. And boy, if that doesn't map onto large intestine, it's called constipation. But beyond that, there's something deeper, a fear of letting go of control that is tied to an incident, and that incident might have been something that caused us grief, whether it was the loss of a loved one, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a pet, the loss of a home, the loss of a job, et cetera, et cetera. So grief tied to loss, and that unexpected, I can't control it. It just happened. I got fired for no reason, and I don't understand why, and what's wrong with me. It's a problem with me. And then the fear of, I'm not in control of my life. And then that could tighten up our whole digestive tube, because the smooth muscle of the food tube is so essentially emotionally related. The vagal conversation is going to be disrupted by the tightening down around the fear of loss of control. And we start to have postural adaptations to that, get tight in the jaw, get tight in the neck. You can see my head's coming forward and forward. As it comes forward, it's going to compress the vagus nerve. As the vagus nerve gets compressed, the conversation gut to brain starts to get interrupted. So that is where psyche lives. That is where psyche lives, in the way our body responds to stress, and in the way that affects psyche, because the gut and the brain don't talk to each other, because our intestinal brain is just as emotional as our cranial brain.
Wow, fascinating. Fascinating. So in Chinese medicine, this tradition is mapping on meaning to different organs and different parts of the body, so we can extrapolate that something with the lung is dealing with grief, and the large intestine, and so on. And what are your thoughts on the perspective of something more like somatic experiencing, where it's just like there can be meaning anywhere in the body? Can you speak?
Absolutely. So I work not in the somatic experiencing tradition, but in the visionary cranial sacral work tradition, where just making prolonged contact with a body part. In my case, I just open the channels, and I don't know if this is true for everybody, but it's true for me. When I hold a body part and I ask, what's happening here? What's happening here? And I just keep posing the question, what's moving, what's not moving, what's happening, what's not happening, then information starts to flood in. And sometimes it's incredibly specific. Sometimes it's, oh, this is a biomechanical blockage because this person rode a skateboard for most of their life, and their one side of their body worked one way, the other side worked the other way. Like, you've got a push-off leg, you've got a stabilizing leg. That torqued the pelvis, and it torqued the diaphragm, and I can feel that from holding an ankle. And it's just, lots of years and years and years of experience. I can feel the way the fascia likes to twist and turn. And then I can sometimes feel that fascial twist translate into an abdominal twist, into even the guts. And then I sense in, and then check other places in the body and follow the pattern. To me, I see it all lit up as light, points of light in my brain about where the blockage is, and then going in and being able to release those blockages sequentially. So the person can have a moment, an epiphany of, oh, yeah, I was skateboarding, and that was a part of this, but I was running away from the situation where it wasn't comfortable to be. And so I was out on my skateboard all the time because it was easier than being at home dealing with my stepmom and her stuff, my siblings and their stuff, my dad and his stuff, etc.
Yeah.
That's sort of an example.
Yeah.
So that would be my route of entry. And of course, there's conversation and creation of a safe container and permission granting along the way. It's not so different, really, than my understanding of somatic experiencing. It's just that's not my training. My training is look into the body and see, with a capital S.
Yeah, and in somatic experiencing, it's as though the person is dictating where the meaning is happening and what's there, and through a process of inquiry. But what you're saying also is that you are being the person to hold their hand as you're manipulating the muscle or the fascia.
Or just making an inquiry, not even necessarily manipulating. Sometimes the body will spontaneously let go, and that's really what's the most interesting to me, is when the body spontaneously lets go. This is happening in our systems all the time, but are we paying attention? So it's just to bring the attention, and this is where there is very much an overlapping with somatic experiencing, is directing the focus of attention to where the potential is for release. And I'm doing it manually, whereas, and with a little conversation, whereas somatic experiencing might be doing it with more conversation and less touch. I'm high touch, less talk. Somatic experiencing is high talk, less touch from what I've observed of it thus far.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great explanation. And I think what you're saying is you are the person that's holding the hand to walk that person to this place within themselves, the shadow that is frightening, that is scary. And
rather avoid maybe.
Yeah. And having that person there is so important. Being present in that is so important, as you said, to create this feeling of safety.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's very helpful. When shadow work is best done in the company of others, I believe. However, there are those of us who have done a lot of shadow work in the Just Say KNOW, Just Say No department, which means massive quantities of psychedelics in silent darkness, Terence McKenna style. You really want to encounter your shadow one-on-one. If you've got the intestinal fortitude for it, you can learn a lot. But I think that's what gave me permission to anoint myself, so to speak, as a person to hold other people's hands, is because I did a lot of that work, very deliberate, conscious encounters with my shadow in high dose psychedelia back in the day, way back in, the 80s and the 90s, a long time ago.
And I wasn't kidding. This is a big theme in these interviews, that people are talking about their psychedelic experiences as being this initiation into the feminine and the shadow.
Exactly. And it's ubiquitous. It's encoded in the substances, presumably largely ayahuasca, mushrooms, the tryptamine hallucinogens, which are found in nature, are part of what I'm talking about, of the creative engine of nature is chemical. It's not just the manifestation of plant genitalia. It's also the chemistry that is somehow complementary to our chemistry, our neurochemistry, that provides this opportunity to go to these places to encounter shadow. And I think shadow is intrinsic in femininity, it as part of the creative engine of nature. Yeah. We have to, that's part of it. It's not rainbows and unicorns only. There's also the dark night of the soul that has to be confronted as part of the process.
Yeah. I'm curious, Ellen, are there certain themes that show up in female bodies in terms of the shadow? That may be too huge of a question, but
let's start with a theme that's dear to my heart at the moment. I'm really wrestling with the notion of shame and how we internalize it as people with vulvas, how having a vulva is linked so directly to shame in a very particular flavor of shame, which has to do with not feeling beautiful, feeling like there's something wrong with us, something weird, that our vulva shape, size, conformation doesn't match some kind of pornographic ideal. And we've been hijacked, our sexuality has been hijacked by pornography. I am a huge fan of pornography in the right circumstances, but the limitations of pornography are that it is a visual medium and it's been so selectively refined to such a narrow spectrum of what's visually acceptable that it leaves the vast majority of people with vulvas feeling deformed. That's a problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you see shame arise in your practice? How does it show up in the body?
Yeah. So I see it in people come to me to have their vulvas mapped. And I find that notion, while I'm deeply committed to providing mapping experiences for people with vulvas, people with penises, and everything in between, I feel like, why should I have to do this? We should all know how to map ourselves. It should be part of our cultural conversation and part of essential basic education, as this is how, these are the pieces, these are the parts, here's where they are, here's what they're called, here's what it feels like when you touch them, here's what they do. They all have a function. They're not random. They have a function. The function is part of the reproductive engine of nature, whether you're making offspring or not. The reproductive engine of nature is part of the sexual energy that lights our fire, that fuels our race car, right?
Yeah.
So nothing is arbitrary. Everything has a function and a purpose in our pelvic floor. We should be taught that, and we're not. So what I can say is that research started in mapping human genitalia and the human body in the brain for people with penises in the 40s. It wasn't until 2009 that anybody even thought to try and make a drawing of a homunculus of a vulva.
2009.
2009. Whoa.
How is that possible?
How is that possible? Because all the research is done on people with penises. And if it's done on a person with a vulva, the overlay and the prejudice is that, oh, well, it's just the same anyway. We'll just say that it's like this for people with vulvas. And guess what? It's not. We're wired differently. Different nerves, more of them, highly concentrated, and it means something. It's not random.
Yeah.
All those nerve endings in the tip of the clitoris are not random. They mean something. So, and that's where shadow lies, is in the suppression of that meaning.
Yeah.
That's cultural shadow.
Yes.
Problematic from my perspective.
Yes. Yes. And I think the connections that you're making so beautifully here as well, which I think are really important, are that these places where we aren't conscious of the shame, let's say in this example, that's impacting our bodies. That's having a very
100%.
real effect, biochemical, physiological effect on the body and our lives.
Right. Because if we don't, it gets back to the concept of mapping. We carry our maps inside of us. And if there's blank places in the map that are devoid of the function of something, devoid of the location of something, and devoid of the sensation of that thing, how can we then bring it into our experience if we essentially don't know what it is, where it is, or what it does? Like, let's talk about the Bartholin's glands, or how about the vestibular bulbs, or what about the perineal sponge? These are all part of our rectal lubrication network, and nobody understands, not nobody, but so few people really, who has heard of their perineal sponge? Who knows what it's for? Who knows how to tickle it just right so it feels as good as touching a clitoris, which it can.
I don't know this stuff. I want to know this stuff.
Yeah, girl, we got to talk.
But yeah, it's like, why don't we? Why aren't we talking about this more, sharing this more, and what are the implications and the consequences of not talking about it?
Yes, well, the consequences of not talking about it is we disengage, we dissociate. And dissociation is our response to shadow, is the turning away of, is the ignorant, deliberate ignorance, or it could be deliverance by omission, or deliberate, or turning away from by commission. Omission is we never knew we had it, and it's not our fault. Commission is we know about it, but we don't want to deal with it, and then we ignore it. And ignoring parts of our body happens at our peril, because if we dissociate from them and then something goes wrong, we're not aware of the thing that's gone wrong. We can't feel it because we are not feeling whole swaths of our body. So mapping is a way to bring those body parts back into conscious, deliberate, concrete awareness. inside of the mental representation of those pieces and parts in our brain. And that happens in the posterior frontal lobe and the anterior parietal lobe. That's where our mapping central is, right where those two lobes come together in the valley where cross is. That's our shadow, is right in the sulcus between those two brain pieces, for instance.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And so really we just want to get our brain to talk to our body.
We want our brain to talk to our body and not be such a big bossy know-it-all.
Yeah.
So the brain needs to acknowledge, but our intelligence, the subcortical intelligence, that's where we ought to be fighting for political rights. Is sort of equity between the cortical intelligence and the subcortical intelligence. It's the new frontier.
The new frontier, indeed. And I think you are at the helm of that.
Well, that's my passion is the exploration of that space and bringing people into it when they're ready to make the journey. Because, you know, not everybody is ready to make the journey, but a lot of people are beginning to be ready to make that journey. And it's so worthwhile. Because to make the hookup between Psyche and Soma, between body and mind, between the mechanism of head placement to vagal, you know, actual vagal information flow, and then what about that deep dive into the sulcus between the posterior frontal lobe and the anterior parietal lobe? Can we actually start to feel those places? Yes, we can. We can start to feel them. We can start to feel boop, 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 boop when they light up. When they light up and we go, oh, that middle real estate just flipped the light switch on. I can feel this part and I can feel the meaning of this part. And I can feel why it's important to include in my self-concept.
Mm-hmm. And what an amazing thing if this were the new political frontier. To map out our bodies and to reclaim the meaning that we've omitted or not been aware of to what's happening in our bodies.
Exactly. Reclaiming our meaning on our terms for ourselves.
Wow.
That would be, that's called empowerment. And empowerment's a really big deal. Somatic empowerment, meaning you're walking in an alive body that's aware of itself.
I just felt that right at the base of my spine.
Beautiful.
Right, that was so deep in my pelvis that I really felt that.
Fantastic.
Mm.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we can do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can do this. And not only that, we can amplify it. We can amplify the energy and the sensation and walk around. You know, I don't want to sort of spin off into some magical realm of tantric bliss thought or speak, but really that's pointing at a specific piece of human experience that's available to us.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to know where are the parts, what are they called, what do they do, how do we amplify the sensation, and then it's okay to want to do that.
Yeah.
That's what's been taken away from us. Like, we're not even supposed to want to do that, especially as people with vulvas. That's a lot of our, that's the unconscious part of our socialization that goes all the way back to witch burnings and who was burned. It was the midwives and the people who were actually hands-on, hands-in helping other people with vulvas deal with unwanted pregnancies or wanting to get pregnant or having problems with no period or how to make the period more comfortable, right? That's what they were doing.
Yeah.
And it was suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there's the opportunity to shift that now in the culture. And that's why I'm so excited about what you're doing here with this exploration of the intersection of shadow and the feminine. It's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let me just pause for a moment, because that, what you said about the witch hunting and this inherent sense of, oh, it's scary to be in these weren't your words, but it's scary to come into our bodies. The shadow is scary, even just to like go into and feel and name, and that can be so terrifying for women, especially if we're talking about the pelvis or the vulva. So why is it so scary, and what do we do about that?
We can talk about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Because trauma is systemic. You could talk about consent. Being touched without consent, being touched when you're unconscious, being touched when you're too young to have consent. Here's an example. I had a client who had urinary issues as an infant and was repeatedly catheterized, meaning, had a catheter put up her urethra before she could talk, many times. And there were infections and there were repeated catheterizations. There was pain. There was a lot of attention and a lot of hands on her body at a time when she was powerless to have consent. Medical trauma. And now there's problems with orgasm, problems with trust, problems with relaxation, problems with giving birth. These were all no-go zones for this person. That's an example of, and it's not just one person. I've worked with many people in my practice that have had this exact scenario, some kind of recurrent problem with thrush and chronic UTIs as a tiny infant with repeated catheterizations that then leads to this sort of very deep dissociation from the pelvic floor, and if just this nameless dread of walking into that territory, handheld or not. It's slow going. It could take, not 1 or 2 months. It could take 1 or 2 years for someone to feel sufficiently safe to go there, even with, a steadfast, steady, calm, collected practitioner to help explain what's happening and why it's happening along the way. And then the systemic levels of denial that she's meeting in her outside world in, marriage therapy or in dance class or in relational therapy workshops where people assume that she has a certain amount of knowledge that she may not have as a result of the terror that goes back to this period in infancy. That's very much the realm of somatic experiencing that they call medical trauma. Yeah. But, I work with it in my way. Somatic experiencing has their way to work with it, but that's an example, for instance, of how someone with a vulva has been systematically dissociated from themselves as a result of unfortunate interventions in early life, and then no education, and then forgetting that it happened. It was a year before I even got the story, a year of conversation and body work before the story even came up about repeated catheterizations and so forth. Oh, that's a whole new piece. That's a big, really important information.
Really important, especially in the world of online courses and rev up your sexual pleasure in 6 weeks and these.
Yeah, you have to go to the body. Yeah. Online is great, and I'm going to be an online provider.
We can't wait. We'll link it below.
Well, partly the reason it's taken so long is I keep hitting this wall of, wait, but what about the body? What about the body? What about the body? We have to have an embodied piece of this. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know what you don't know, getting out your mirror and doing a self-exploration, it's very important. But what about those places that don't have any sensation yet? You think that's the way it is, but they're actually very sensation rich if you could reassociate. And sometimes people need help with the reassociation piece. Mm. So if you promised, mind-blowing orgasms in 6 weeks, right? That used to be the line back in the early 90s, right? They take you there. And there'd be people that couldn't go, and they go, well, what's wrong with me? Something's wrong with me. And it's not that it's wrong, it's that there were a series of events that need to get unearthed, pulled out of the shadow and pulled into reality so you can choose how you want to work with them and reassociate at a pace that feels safe.
Mm-hmm. At a pace that feels safe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how do we do that? What kind of tools do we have?
Right. So tools that we have are education first and foremost. So I go to books, and books that I really love are books around the multiplicity of vulva shapes, sizes, conformation. I think we all need to be spending our time with noses in those books. My favorite one right now is A Celebration of Vulva Diversity. It's from a woman in the Netherlands who's done drawings, done vulva portraits of dozens and dozens and dozens of women, and published it as a book. But there's many books that show multiplicity of vulva. So getting over the shame about conformation, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, going through a mapping process on your own, sitting with a book and saying, okay, where's my clitoris? Oh, this is the hood. Can I retract my hood? Here's my outer lips. Here's my inner lips. What's the sensation like as I walk my fingers from my outer lips toward my introitus? How's it feel around the introitus versus in the little space between my outer lips and my inner labia?
Mm-hmm.
You know, all these places have different sensate signatures, and we could start to map those on ourselves. And then if we want more information, we could find a sexological body worker and go for a mapping session. Sexological body workers do that. That's part of the training and part of the curriculum is learning about mapping and its importance. So that's an opportunity that people could take advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
So there's ways you can work on yourself. There's ways that you can work with others. And there's sexological body workers all over the world. You know, almost every country has one or two now. It's been going since 2003. So that's a lot of sexological body workers that have been trained in many corners of the globe.
I'm curious, what do you see when women go through this process, when they come out the other side, when they've met the shadow, they've had their hand held, and they confronted something that they knew was icky and didn't want to, but they did, and then what is on the other side of that?
Ever blooming curiosity. That's what's on the other side of it. This like lust for information about, wow, I feel grounded in myself. I feel powerful. I feel confident. And I know there's so much more that I can do because I walked through that scary, hard place. I came out the other side, and coming out the other side feeds the appetite for more. So and that's where the good news is, the empowerment is in building appetite for more self-knowledge, more, knowledge is power, and to be in our power, we need to be in our knowledge. And then it becomes this self-reinforcing, you could just call it a virtuous cycle of learning and more empowerment and more learning and more empowerment, and then confidence, and then this blooming into the world as knowing exactly where you stand, who you stand with, what you stand for, as part of, as you open up the pelvic floor, you open up your connection to the earth, and then you can be in reciprocity with the earth's own energies. And I think that's really where we're missing, as we're so busy in our infatuation with the screen that we're missing our infatuation with the earth, and we need to go back to that. But the gateway is, in the vulva.
And also the infatuation from the neck up,
exactly.
where actually
cortical versus subcortical.
Yeah, where there's so much empowerment to be found in the cells and in the very body, and like you said, the pelvic floor, and even this connection I find so interesting between the pelvic floor and the earth's energy and our ability to stand in who we are. Mm-hmm. Because that doesn't actually take place from the neck up. We
think it does. That is the delusion that who we are lives up here. No, who we are is all of us. And especially from the neck down, even more so from the waist down, even more from the pelvic floor down. You could think of it as a series of diaphragms. We have the diaphragm of the dura at the neck. We have the diaphragm of the soft palate at the roof of the mouth. We have a thoracic diaphragm. We have the pelvic diaphragm. We have the diaphragm of the arches of our feet. Each one of those is a messenger system that has a relationship with the Earth's electromagnetic fields that are constantly coming up as food for our body. That's food, that's nourishment. But when we are only living from the neck up, we're not paying attention to the quality of that nourishment, nor can we feel it. And so the invitation is come south of the jaw into the subcortical intelligence that can connect us back to earth. That's really, something that I see disappearing at an alarming rate the younger my clients are. It's sort of terrifying, actually.
And I appreciate that you tied it into empowerment, because empowerment is also so framed as such a cognitive thing that's only knowledge-based, but there's so much empowerment to be found in reclaiming the body.
Feeling-based. Sensation and feeling-based.
Yeah.
How can our sensations start to inform us? Because they then become a sort of a knowledge base for making decisions, because our whole body can become more involved. That's called intuition.
Beautiful. Ellen, is there anything else you want to share with us about the shadow, the feminine?
I'd like to share a book. There's a book that I am reading, and it's just so beautifully poetic. And it's talking about scars and how scars are symbols of psyche, and psyche is manifest in scars. And this is written from the point of view of a Jungian analyst whose name is Emily Rose Rothenberg. The name of the book is The Jewel in the Wound. And I think that's just a beautiful way to think about scar tissue as the jewel in the wound, because there's always a connection to the feeling body in a scar. Scars can resolve like this, or they can take longer to resolve, depending on the tenacity of the scar and how long it's been there, and what is our biochemical reality under our skin. That also determines how long scars last. But the psyche and soma part of scar, there's always an emotion that's been buried. And I think that's part of what holds a scar in place, is the emotion that's taking form of hardening of fascia. I think that's an emotional event inside the subcortical intelligence. And that can be coaxed into release. And as that's coaxed into release, then we can integrate that sequestered piece of belief, of emotion, back into the system as a whole. And that is what enables our energy to flow better, which is part of that empowerment we were talking about.
So fascinating.
Yeah.
And
working with scars.
yes, which is a big part of your work, isn't it? To
part of my practice, I work a lot with birth-related scar tissue, and because birth is such a enormous journey for people to take, the emotions that get buried in the tremendum of that experience sometimes need to be reintegrated to find the empowerment in the birth process. And that's really part of the work I do at the physical level, at the hands-on, hands-in level of work.
And does the emotional aspect happen concurrently? Is it happening at its own pace?
So when I'm working hands-in with tissues in the vulva, in particularly, it happens concurrently in real time. I felt scar after scar after scar just disappear, one tear, and then, whoa, where's the pain? What happened? It hurt. Wait, it hurt. Now it doesn't hurt. How did that, what? And I can feel it. It's a tough, fibrous, like a tight violin string inside of the connective tissue matrix under the vaginal mucosa. And then it just gone in an instant like that. And it's like, how is this even possible? But it has to be an authentic moment of emotional awakening. If that doesn't happen, the scar doesn't change. The physiognomy, the actual form of the scar just remains.
No matter how much manipulation or
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. I worked with a woman for 3 sessions, but they happened over 3 years. It took a year for her to summon the courage to come in for each session. And she had this gnarly scar left over from a childbirth. It was, 7, he was 8, he's 9. And then one time she came in and she just started prattling on about the weather. And she lived in a place where it was snowing. And she said, yeah, the snow's been really intense. And then she just dropped it in like, boom. Oh, I remember during the childbirth, the doctor looked at my husband. He winked and he said, this stitch is for you. And then she started crying. And then the scar let go. And it just happened like that fast.
Wow.
And it gives me chills to even talk about that, because it was one of those moments of, she was so avoidant of feeling the pain from that. She'd suppressed it, and it wasn't part, she did everything to ignore it. And a practitioner she was working with said, you have to go see Ellen, you have to take care of this, you have to. And so it took a lot of courage for her to come in and do that work. And her body did it for her, because her cortical brain was blah, blah, blah about the weather, and here's what's happening with my mom, and no. And then her body went, what? No, this.
Yeah.
That moment when that thing happened, we're going to remember it now, because this is the place where it happened. And that's the Soma reaching into the psyche and going, come in and feel what's going on. And she was willing to make that journey. And ever after that, no more painful intercourse. 9 years of painful intercourse. Yeah,
Wow.
it was that kind of moment, but it took a lot of moments to get there.
Yeah. And as you said, a lot of courage.
A lot of courage.
It takes a lot of courage and inner fortitude to meet those places within ourselves.
Absolutely.
Ellen, thank you so very much for your insight and your brilliance. And how can people get in touch with you? What do you have going on? What would you like to share with everybody? Because what
I have going on is a sparkly new website, brand new, so people can come and visit me. And I have a lot of blog material up at ellenheed.com, so you can reach me at my website. You can contact me through my website if you have questions about a way to go. If you have questions about, if this conversation teased up anything in the psyche, and people want to ask me, okay, what do I do? It's individual and it's per person, so they can reach me through my website. We can have that conversation. And then I'm working on an e-course around shame and releasing shame from the body. And what are the components, the biological components, the psychological components, and the place where they create dysfunction together within the body, within the nervous system and in the connective tissue system. I'm working on an e-course to explain that.
Excellent. And I was fortunate enough to take an in-person course on that same subject with you, and it was truly amazing. So I can't recommend this upcoming course enough. And again, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for tuning in and watching, and we will see you in the next interview.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, Blair.
Thanks, Ellen.